is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida. And today we return to our normal question and answer format here at the Vlog, and our question today comes to us from Porpoise Fathom. And Porpoise Fathom has a question about incarnation. And it's a fairly complex question, but I'm going to do my best to answer it within the short format of the Vlog. And the question is this: is there in Correllian teaching a form of escape from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth as there is in Buddhism? Is there a point of salvation to end the cycle of incarnation and escape suffering? And if there is not a technique for this, do we believe that the cycle of incarnation is eternal, or does it come to an end at some point? And what would our teaching on this subject be? And the thing that makes this complicated is that there's more than one thing in it that needs to be addressed. But I'm going to start with the more obvious aspect. And in her book, The 5 Mystic Secrets, which my late mother wrote under her pseudonym of Elizabeth Greenwood, she talks about the cycle of incarnation. And what she says is our primary teaching, that yes, indeed, there is a point where the soul completes all of the lessons that this system of incarnation has to teach, and reunites with deity. What does that mean? Well, in many ways we learn that when we get there. It's usually described as reuniting with deity, which is not a loss of self, but rather an expansion of self. And what happens after that isn't necessarily an end of our adventures, but we don't really know what happens after that beyond returning to our source. It may be that we begin a new series of incarnations. It may be that it's something else. But it is beyond our current experience. But yes, we would say that there is a point where the system of incarnation, of birth, death, and rebirth does come to an end for the individual soul. Of course, you also have to bear in mind that we do teach that the soul is very complex and can have many different incarnations going at any given moment. But that is a totally different Vlog. We still would say that eventually that cycle of incarnation does come to an end. Now, the second part of the question, is there a point of salvation from suffering? This needs to be addressed because it has an underlying assumption, which is that the cycle of incarnation is about suffering, which is a Buddhist idea, but is not a Correllian idea. Our teaching is that incarnation in this physical world is about learning and perfecting the self, that there are many lessons here to be learned and that we have come willingly and intentionally to learn them. Sometimes our soul loses sight of the fact that it has come willingly and intentionally to learn those lessons, but nonetheless it is the case. Therefore, leaving the cycle of incarnation is not about leaving suffering behind, but rather is about avoiding lessons. And we would not regard this as being necessarily a desirable thing. We would say the soul can rest during its journey. It need not be a constant grind of incarnation. But as long as the soul has need to learn these lessons, it will continue to incarnate, and interrupting that cycle is not really to the benefit of the soul. Now, the second point in this question which we must consider has to do with the idea of suffering. Is there a point of salvation and deliverance from suffering related to incarnation? This part of the question has an underlying assumption, which is that incarnation is a matter of suffering, and that as long as we are incarnating, we must perforce suffer. And this is a Buddhist idea. And although in many ways Correllianism and Buddhism have a great deal in common, there are certain things we do not have in common, and this is one of them. Buddhism teaches that suffering comes from attachment, which we would generally agree with, but that it is also part and parcel of incarnation, which we would not agree with. We teach that incarnation is about learning and perfecting the self. And although suffering can be part of it, and can even be a necessary part of it, depending on how you define that term, it is certainly not the nature of it. And very often what we perceive as suffering is actually the dissonance between what our conscious mind desires and what our soul desires, because these are not necessarily the same things. And when we relax and allow ourselves to be guided from the soul level, very often much of that perception of suffering is not there. So is there a point of salvation from suffering? We would say yes, when you shift your perception, that even the most difficult situations can have many good things in them if you look for them, and that those difficult situations are part and parcel of learning the lessons, but they aren't necessarily about suffering. It can be a byproduct, but it is only a byproduct and not necessarily a byproduct that one must experience. If one willingly learns the lessons, if one does not struggle against them, there is certainly much less perception of suffering. And so we would not really be looking for a salvation point per se, but rather an enlightenment in our way of thinking and looking at the world and our way of looking at incarnation. And we would say then that it is not necessary to have a salvation point because you have moved beyond the problem. So, is there an end to the cycle of incarnation? Well, yes, we would say there is a natural end to it when all of the lessons have been learned, though it may lead on to new and different things that we do not know about. But is there a desire to exit it prematurely in Correllian teaching? No, there is not. There may be a desire to rest from it, but there is not a desire to leave incarnation before having fulfilled its purposes, because to do so defeats the purposes and therefore is not in the best interest of the soul. So, that's my attempt at a quick and short answer to a very complex question. I hope you find it helpful and interesting, and until next time, may you blessed be. Pray for peace. Pray for love. Pray for stability. Pray for the nation where you live. Pray for the world.